tactile things can bring with them incredible recall and memory. I've preached before on this moment, but in the summer of 2013, I found myself on the threshold of my 30-day silent retreat up on the coast of Massachusetts on the seashore. And as much as I had looked forward for years for that opportunity to get away in silence for 30 days with the Lord, when it came to it, I found myself terrified. Terrified that I would find myself laid bare, that I couldn't handle it, that I wasn't prepared just to be naked in front of the Lord and nothing else for 30 days. The million thoughts and doubts that came to mind. And at that place, on the seashore, off the shore a bit, there was a giant rock, only accessible when the tide was at a certain level and exposed a number of very treacherous, slippery rocks that you could cross to get out to it. But I crossed out there, climbed the rock, and stood in the midst of the ocean, the wind whipping very strongly, and looking out on the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. And at that moment, felt a very intimate touch of the Lord asking, "What are you afraid of?" And it changed everything and prepared me to go into that time of silence. It's a time that sometimes in theology or philosophy they call it a liminal moment, the moment where things of heaven and earth seem to touch, looking out on the infinite horizon of the ocean, something bigger than the human mind can comprehend, and encountering God there. All of these memories of this moment came rushing back to me in February when I was in the Holy Land at visiting the Church of Peter's Primacy. The Church of Peter's Primacy is located on the very spot that we hear about in today's gospel, the place where Jesus prepared breakfast for them on the seashore. And in the midst of this small church, it's a very simple church. It's not amongst all the popular sites to visit in the Holy Land. It's one of the less popular, probably because only the Catholics want to visit a church called Peter's Primacy. But in this small, simple church, there's a large rock that's exposed in the middle of the church floor right in front of the sanctuary. And you can hear the sound of the water, the waves outside. And when I knelt down and touched the rock, all of this came flooding back to me. My own experience with God on the seashore. And as I touched the rock, and in fact, I'm holding throughout this Mass, I brought a very small piece home with me. And so even now while touching it, I can remember what it felt like touching the rock. I can only imagine what was rushing back to memory for Peter during the sequence of events in today's gospel. For, as I only truly appreciated on this visit to the church, this site where Jesus revealed himself to his disciples was just down the road from Capernaum, the place where Peter lived, the place where he fished, the place where Jesus first encountered him, called him, and invited him to leave behind his nets so that he could be a fisher of men. The place that Peter knew like the back of his hand, and in the general vicinity of where he had seen Jesus do so much teaching, so many miracles. Right up the hill is where the multiplication of the loaves and fishes took place, where the Beatitudes were presented. Back in this place, Peter has this encounter with the Lord, and I can only imagine the way in which all and so many other things came rushing back to him. And so, for the sake of today's gospel, which has so much richness in it, there's many themes on Peter's primacy. There's a lot to unpack about shepherding in this gospel, but I'll bracket that and leave that aside. This reading often comes up at ordinations or the consecration of bishops. But I'd like to unpack 4 takeaways for Christian discipleship that I believe are revealed in this gospel passage today. This first of which is that Peter did not earn his calling. He didn't earn anything. As we look back over the Gospels, we remember that Peter was a simple, uneducated fisherman. In his time following Jesus, we know that he tended to be very rash, impetuous, constantly putting his foot in his mouth, one moment with brilliant insight, the next moment leaving Jesus just shaking his head, like, I can't believe you just said that. And at the time at Caesarea Philippi, when he declares that Jesus is the Christ, Jesus is clear to reveal, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. Said differently, you have not revealed this or known this because you are brilliant, because you're smarter than your brothers, but because God has entrusted you with this insight. Then, at the Last Supper, recently we heard, he warned Peter that Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat. But I pray your own faith will not fail, and after you return to me, you must strengthen your brothers. Then, at the end of today's gospel passage, we hear him speaking about the manner that Peter will die. You've always dressed yourself, but one day someone will dress you for you and take you where you do not want to go. None of this speaks to anything that Peter brings to the table, but what God plans to do with Peter. And so it's an important reminder to us, as this first point, that God does not call those who are qualified, but he qualifies those whom he calls. So often we run in fear, thinking we are not worthy to be holy, to accomplish great things in God's name, but no one ever has been. Our greatness, if we can even have such a thing, can accomplish nothing. But it is God who gives what is needed to those whom he calls. And so the second takeaway is that this gospel passage reminds Peter that he can do nothing without Christ. First of all, by the very account that they go fishing, there's something notable in that. This is a return to old ways. Since Peter left his nets, since James and John left their nets, Andrew left the nets, they were called to be fishers of men, and now, lost since the time of the resurrection, not knowing what to do, they go back to their old ways. This may seem innocent enough, but it's very symbolic. They get back on the boat and they start fishing again. Except the problem is they can't catch anything. If this is not interesting enough for skilled fishermen, the place where they were fishing, the place where Jesus reveals himself at this site, is where a hot spring empties into the Sea of Galilee. This spot literally is like fishing with dynamite. It is the perfect spot for fishing, and yet they catch nothing. Until at dawn, Jesus reveals himself to them, asks, "Were you able to catch anything?" "No." "Why don't you try over there?" And then, of course, there's more fish than they can possibly haul in. The empty catch versus the overabundance at the direction of Christ reminds Peter and reminds us that we must follow God's will. All things are possible through his grace, but we can accomplish nothing without him. When we start to think we accomplish things through our own greatness, through our own skills and talents, our ingenuity, we quickly fall away from the Lord and remember that it was him all along. Remember, he qualifies those whom he calls. So Peter remembers that he was not qualified, but God called him, and that all things are possible, but only when he is with Christ. So the third takeaway is the reminder that grace builds upon nature. This is an old theological maxim. Grace builds upon nature. God freely bestows the gift of his grace on us. We are created in his image and likeness with a human nature. That human nature is wounded by sin. We all are familiar with the wounds we carry, either from our family history, our upbringing, things we've suffered during life, our own hang-ups, our fears, whatever it may be. God's grace does not replace or eradicate our nature, but it builds upon it. And so, we can begin to understand a radical transformation that we hear from today's gospel to today's first reading. The same Peter who so often falls flat on his face suddenly in front of the Sanhedrin, the very place before where he denied Christ 3 times on the night of the Passion, now he's the one being threatened with physical punishment and says, "We cannot follow men, but must follow God." Is this a different Peter? Or has Peter been healed to such a point that God's grace can accomplish powerful things in him? This was a lesson that is beaten into your head for good reason in seminary formation, where so often both men studying and those who support and pray for them think it's like priest school to go learn how to do priest things. But the majority of the time of that formation is cleaning up one's own house to make room for God's grace to do mighty things. If you present God with a messy house, his grace will have to work around very carefully. But if you present something pristine, God can really fill that vessel and do amazing things. It's all his grace, but he respects our freedom. So what is the ultimate takeaway from this? It's that if we're going to focus on something, we need to focus not on our mighty gifts, how smart we think we are, how wise, our own ingenuity, but instead, we need to do the work at home. We need to be healed. Sinful patterns in our life, places of great fear, that is the work that we do through prayer, sometimes through counseling. But to clean up the house, to allow God to reign mightily in it, and to not worry about the rest. God can take care of that part. Right after the end of the Gospels, we hear it today, Peter asks Jesus, pointing to John over in the distance, well, what about him? Jesus has just foreshadowed Peter's own crucifixion. Well, what about him? Why is it your concern? What if I should say he never dies? What concern is that to you? But you follow me. So the takeaway is that we need to not worry about what others are doing, what God is doing in other people, but instead clean up our own house and then allow God's grace to perfect our nature. So that's 3 takeaways. God does not call the qualified, he qualifies those whom he calls. So he calls us in our imperfection. We must follow God's will if we want to accomplish anything. And grace builds upon nature. We must start with our own house, clean it up to invite the Lord in. Finally, that brings us to perhaps the most poignant and powerful part of today's gospel, which is the episode of reconciliation between Jesus and Peter. This account powerfully calls to mind what needed to be reconciled, and in fact, perhaps a more tantalizing question. So what's the difference between Peter and Judas? We're really hard on Judas. We like Peter. But what's the difference between the two men? Both were apostles. Both were counted among the 12. Both were called. They both received the call. Both knew Jesus, were counted amongst his friends. Both followed him. Both heard his teachings. Both witnessed the same miracles. Both of them were warned at the Last Supper about the cost of betrayal. Both were warned that Satan wanted to sift the apostles like wheat. Both betrayed Jesus anyways. We focus on Judas's betrayal, but Peter betrayed him too. And both felt remorse for their betrayal. We often drop off after Jesus is betrayed. We forget what happens with Judas afterwards. Judas feels a great deal of remorse. He takes the money the chief priest gave him, throws it back in the temple. He feels horrible. But where the difference lies is what happens next. Judas, in his sorrow, is focused on himself. He feels bad. He feels self-loathing, condemnation of himself, hopelessness, and ultimately despair that leads to his tragic end as he takes his own life. Peter, in his sorrow, is focused on Jesus. He's focused on the friend he has wounded. Why else do you think that Peter leaps into the sea when he realizes that Jesus is on the seashore? Upon hearing the very name of his friend and master, he leaps and goes swimming. He can't even wait for the boat to get to the shore. And so there on the seashore, Peter has allowed himself to be brought to the moment of reconciliation. There, Jesus has prepared everything. The same charcoal fire by which Peter denied him 3 times on the night of the Passion. On the charcoal fire on the seashore, Jesus has prepared it. And notice, he doesn't call him Peter, he calls him Simon. Jesus sets this up as a reset. Simon, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know. Do you love me? 3 denials, 3 I love yous. Jesus does the work of reconciliation and restores Peter. Peter and Judas both fell. We all fall. But Peter was reconciled. We focus on pride in so many ways, but there is a hidden pride in the stubborn refusal to be reconciled. We can call it self-loathing. We can call it shame. We can call it avoidance. There's pride in all of those things. The pride of refusal to allow God to heal us. Thank God, Peter was reconciled. And so, the passage today, as we heard it, ended with 2 words his disciples had heard so many times: follow me. And so, Peter and we can look back on all that's crammed into this one episode. God calls us once again. God called Peter once again, not because we're qualified, but because he qualifies us. Peter and we are reminded that we can do nothing without Jesus, that grace builds on nature. If we only make room for God, focus on what we can do, God will take care of the rest. And that we must set aside pride and, in love of the beloved who has loved us, allow ourselves to be reconciled to him. If we can follow all of these things, no matter how often we fall, Jesus will bring his healing and renew that calling as he did to Peter, the calling that is renewed to all of his apostles after the resurrection and is now renewed to all of us in the season of Easter. Follow me.